When Unteroffizier Hans Müller stepped off the train at Medicine Hat, Alberta in the summer of 1943, his first sight was not the brutal guards or prison towers he had been conditioned to expect, but rather a Royal Canadian mounted police officer offering him a cigarette and asking in broken German if his journey from the port had been comfortable. Müller, a 24-year-old Wehrmacht soldier captured in North Africa after months of fighting under Rommel in the Desert Campaign, assumed this initial courtesy represented a psychological trick designed to make prisoners lower their guard before the real brutality began. What shocked him over the following weeks was the gradual realization that Canadian treatment of German prisoners was not a deception, but represented genuine adherence to Geneva Convention, standards that often exceeded minimum requirements, providing food rations that were better than what many Canadian civilians received under wartime rationing and housing, conditions that seemed luxurious compared to the frontline circumstances most prisoners had endured. The transformation from suspicious enemy soldiers expecting harsh treatment to prisoners who wrote letters home describing Canada as unexpectedly humane revealed profound gaps between Nazi propaganda about Allied cruelty and the reality of imprisonment in a nation that viewed proper treatment of POWs as both a legal obligation and a reflection of Canadian values. The scale of German prisoner detention in Canada during World War II was substantial, with approximately 34,000 German POWs held in camps scattered across the country by 1945, making Canada one of the major detention centers for Axis prisoners outside of Europe itself. The decision to house German prisoners in Canada rather than Britain reflected practical considerations about security, space, and resources. Britain, facing possible invasion in 1940 and dealing with severe overcrowding in its own prison facilities, requested that Canada accept thousands of German POWs and civilian internees, and the Canadian government agreed, despite initial concerns about managing enemy prisoners so far from the European theatre. The remoteness of Canadian camps from any possible escape route back to Germany made Canada an ideal location for holding prisoners who might attempt escape if held closer to combat zones. And the vast Canadian landscape offered numerous locations where prison camps could be established far from population centres, while still allowing prisoners to work in agriculture or forestry. The largest POW camps in North America were established at Lethbridge and Medicine Hat in Alberta, each designed to hold up to 12,500 prisoners. Massive facilities that required extensive infrastructure, including dormitories housing 350 men, recreation halls accommodating 3,000 prisoners, multiple educational huts, workshops, and dining facilities. The construction and operation of these camps represented significant Canadian investment in maintaining standards that went beyond simple containment. Unlike prison facilities designed purely for punishment, the Canadian camps incorporated spaces for education, recreation, and work that recognized prisoners would be detained for potentially years, and that humane treatment served both moral and practical purposes. The Royal Canadian Mounted Police, along with veterans guards composed of World War I veterans and later Canadian Army units, provided security for the camps, though the guard presence was often minimal compared to the prisoner population, reflecting Canadian confidence that proper treatment would reduce escape attempts and maintain order. The food provided to German prisoners became one of the most visible and controversial aspects of their treatment. Canadian civilians living near POW camps complained that German prisoners received better food than they themselves could obtain under wartime rationing, observations that were largely accurate given that POWs received the same provisions as Canadian soldiers guarding them, though guards noted that POWs had better cooks and more time to prepare meals. For German prisoners arriving from the North African theatre, where food shortages had been chronic, or from European fronts where military rations were increasingly inadequate, the abundance of food in Canadian camps seemed almost unbelievable. Hans Müller, in letters preserved by his family and later shared with Canadian researchers, described his astonishment at receiving 3 full meals daily with portions that seemed extravagant, including meat, fresh vegetables, bread, and dairy products that had become rare luxuries for German soldiers in the final war years. The cognitive dissonance between Nazi propaganda claiming that Allied forces starved their prisoners and the reality of Canadian camp kitchens serving substantial meals created psychological confusion that forced many prisoners to reconsider fundamental assumptions about their enemies. The WWII treatment German prisoners received from RCMP officers and Canadian Guards reflected a combination of professional duty, personal decency, and national self-conception about proper behavior. Unlike the stereotypical brutal prison guard of wartime propaganda, Canadian personnel generally approached their duties with a pragmatic recognition that maintaining order required treating prisoners with basic respect. Documented accounts from both prisoners and guards describe relationships that, while maintaining necessary boundaries, often developed into something approaching mutual regard. Former prisoner Horst Liebeck, a Luftwaffe fighter pilot shot down over England and imprisoned at Heron Bay Camp on Lake Superior, later returned to Canada after the war, became a Canadian citizen in 1958 and built a successful business, a trajectory that would have been impossible had his imprisonment been marked by brutality or hatred. The fact that numerous German POWs chose to immigrate to Canada permanently after the war speaks volumes about the treatment they received and the impressions of Canadian society they formed during captivity. The work programs that employed German prisoners in Canadian agriculture and forestry represented another aspect of camp life that surprised prisoners who expected either idleness or brutal forced labor. By 1945, approximately 11,000 German POWs were employed in various tasks, including logging and farm work, receiving nominal payment for their labor. Unlike forced labor systems that treated prisoners as expendable resources, Canadian work programs operated under Geneva Convention guidelines that prohibited dangerous work, directly supporting the war effort, and required reasonable working conditions and compensation. Rudolf Ries, a German POW who worked on the farm of Joe and Mary Kayser near Lethbridge, was treated like family, had his own small house on the farm, didn't have to return to camp each night, and shared meals with the family. When the war ended and Ries had to leave, Farmer Joe Kayser described it as a sad parting, revealing relationships that transcended the prisoner guard. Dynamic and suggested genuine human connections formed despite the circumstances. The recreational and educational opportunities available in Canadian POW camps further distinguished the prisoner experience from expectations of harsh confinement. Inside Lethbridge's Camp 133, regular soccer tournaments were organized, and camps across Canada featured theatrical productions, musical performances, educational classes, and hobby activities that occupied prisoner time constructively. German prisoners established their own internal organizations, managing cultural activities, producing camp newspapers, organizing language classes, and creating artistic works ranging from wood carvings to paintings. The permission and even encouragement Canadian authorities gave to these activities reflected a philosophy that viewed long-term detention as requiring mental stimulation and creative outlets to prevent psychological deterioration. For prisoners who had spent months or years in combat conditions where survival was the only concern, the opportunity to attend classes, participate in sports, or engage in artistic pursuits seemed almost surreal, creating an environment that bore little resemblance to preconceptions about prisoner of war life. The complex political dynamics surrounding POW treatment in Canada emerged dramatically during the shackling crisis of 1942. After the Dieppe raid, Germany ordered British prisoners captured there to be shackled in retaliation for alleged British orders to shackle German prisoners during the operation. Britain responded by ordering that German prisoners in their custody, including those held in Canada, be shackled as well. The Canadian government, which had been holding approximately 16,000 German prisoners at that point, faced a decision about whether to comply with British orders. At Bowmanville Camp in Ontario, German prisoners resisted shackling by barricading themselves in camp buildings, leading to violent confrontation in which one prisoner was shot, and more than a dozen guards were wounded in hand-to-hand combat. The Canadian response to this crisis proved significant. Rather than escalating violence, Canadian authorities decided to stop following British orders and manage their camps according to their own interpretation of Geneva Convention requirements, asserting sovereignty over detention policies and refusing to implement measures they viewed as violating international humanitarian law. This decision reflected Canadian determination to maintain treatment standards they considered appropriate, regardless of British pressure. Establishing Canada's independent position on POW policy, the psychological impact on German prisoners of receiving humane treatment from an enemy they had been taught to despise, created lasting cognitive dissonance that many prisoners processed in different ways. Former POW Ed Billett later explained that before arriving in Canada, most prisoners thought the country was all bush, Indians, and so on, and knew Canadians were good fighters but little else. The discovery that Canada was a developed nation with beauty, opportunity, and people who treated prisoners with basic decency forced reconsideration of Nazi propaganda narratives. Some prisoners maintained Nazi ideology, despite contradictory evidence, isolating themselves within camps and refusing to participate in activities they viewed as fraternization with the enemy. Others gradually adapted their worldviews, recognizing that the treatment they received suggested that not everything they had been told about their enemies was accurate. Still others experienced more dramatic ideological transformations, rejecting Nazi beliefs entirely and embracing the values represented by Canadian society. The diversity of prisoner responses reflected individual differences in commitment to Nazi ideology, personal experiences during the war, and psychological resilience in confronting information that challenged fundamental assumptions. Internal dynamics within POW camps sometimes turned violent as hardcore Nazi prisoners attempted to maintain ideological control over fellow captives who showed signs of wavering loyalty. In 1943 and 1944, 2 POWs were murdered by fellow prisoners on orders from internal Nazi leadership within the camps, crimes that led to RCMP investigations and eventual arrests of several German prisoners who were transferred to Northern Ontario lumber camps. These incidents revealed the existence of shadow power structures within the camps, where committed Nazis attempted to enforce loyalty through intimidation and violence, viewing prisoners who cooperated too enthusiastically with Canadian authorities as traitors, deserving punishment. Canadian authorities responded by segregating hardcore Nazi prisoners from the general population, with Medicine Hat Camp designated for the most committed Nazi prisoners, attempting to reduce their influence over other prisoners who might otherwise adapt more readily to camp life. The necessity of these measures demonstrated limits to the effectiveness of humane treatment in changing deeply held ideological commitments, though the fact that murders were investigated and punished also showed that Canadian authorities would not tolerate internal prisoner violence even when victims were themselves enemy soldiers. The question of what would happen to German prisoners after the war created anxiety and hope in roughly equal measures. Canadian public opinion was divided, with some Canadians arguing through letters to editors and radio commentary that prisoners who had proven themselves in farms and factories should be allowed to stay as desirable citizens, while others, including the Canadian Legion at its 1946 Dominion Convention, passed resolutions opposing any German POWs remaining in Canada. For prisoners who had experienced Canadian hospitality and come to appreciate the country, the prospect of returning to a devastated Germany held little appeal. Harry Pohl, a 19-year-old merchant seaman captured and sent to work on a farm near Brooks, Alberta, told his new wife after returning to Hamburg that he was going back to Canada, and she agreed, reflecting decisions made by numerous former prisoners who saw better futures in Canada than in rebuilding a destroyed homeland. The Canadian government eventually established immigration programs that allowed some former POWs to return as immigrants, though the process required demonstrating that they had not been committed Nazis and could contribute to Canadian society. The legacy of German POW treatment in Canada extends beyond individual stories to illuminate broader questions about how nations treat captured enemies and what such treatment reveals about national character. Canada's decision to maintain Geneva Convention standards even when doing so was politically controversial or practically inconvenient reflected values, that would become central to Canadian international identity in the post-war period. The treatment succeeded in its immediate practical goal of maintaining order in camps and preventing escape attempts that would have diverted resources from the war effort. More significantly, the humane treatment created positive impressions of Canada among thousands of German prisoners, some of whom became Canadian citizens, and all of whom carried memories that complicated Nazi narratives about Allied brutality. The shock that Hans Müller and countless other German prisoners experienced upon discovering that Canadian Mounties treated them like guests rather than hated enemies revealed the power of propaganda to create expectations and the equal power of humane treatment to contradict those expectations, one cigarette and comfortable train journey at a time.